5. Holiness and Law. The relationship of holiness to law is a very real and important one, however much neglected. Attention has been diverted in recent years to erroneous concepts by the influential work of Rudolf Otto, The Idea of the Holy, 1923. Holiness cannot be defined in and of itself. It is a transcendental attribute of God and must be defined first of all in relation to Him. Thus, first, holiness must be defined in terms of Scripture as separation, non-trespassable, with the implication of devotion. It has reference to the unapproachableness of God. As Voss pointed out, it has an ethical significance. It refers to God's majesty and omnipotence. In reference to man, quote, "The meaning is never simply that of moral goodness, considered in itself, but always ethical goodness seen in relation to God." End quote. Israel became holy because God, in His electing grace, made His covenant people His sons by adoption. Deuteronomy 14, 1-2. Now the fact that holiness involves separation, or very literally a cutting, makes apparent immediately its basic and essential relation to law. The law simply states the principle of the cutting or separation. Wherever there is law, there is inescapably a line of separation. Conversely, wherever there is no law, there is no line of separation. Antinomian sects may speak earnestly of holiness, but because of their denial of law, they have denied the principle of holiness. It follows, therefore, that we can say, second, that every biblical law is concerned with holiness. Every law, by setting a line of division between the people of the law as against the outlaws, the people outside the law, is concerned with establishing a principle of separation in terms of God. Some laws set forth also the principle of separation in a symbolic as well as a literal form. For example, in Numbers 19:11-22, separation from death is required, and ritual purification after contact with the dead. See also Leviticus 5:2-3, 11 verse 8, 21 verses 1-4, 22 verses 4 and 6, Numbers 31, 19-20, and 9 verse 10. Israel had been called to be a holy people. Exodus 19:6, 22:31, 23:24, Leviticus 19:2, Deuteronomy 7:6, 14:2 and verse 21, 26, 18-19. Since God is not the God of the dead but of the living, Matthew 22:32, to be God's covenant man means separation from death itself, ultimately. This separation is set forth in these laws. Their destiny being life, the covenant people of God are to regard death as something from which they are being separated by God. It is clear that the Mosaic Law affirmed the principle of quarantine against communicable diseases in full recognition of their contagious nature. But even more basically, the law of separation was operative in such legislation to affirm the holiness of God's people, Leviticus 13 and Deuteronomy 24:8. God's people are destined for health as well as life, and hence they are quote-unquote cut off from diseases symbolically as well as in protection from contagion. Not only death and disease were to be separated from the people of life, but also eunuchs and bastards, Deuteronomy 23, 1-2. Various forms of self-mutilation, Leviticus 19:27, Deuteronomy 14, 1-2, were forbidden, as was tattooing, Leviticus 19:28. Sickness and age might mar the body. The people of God were forbidden to mar it. Some of these marks represented covenants with other gods, an added factor in separation from them. With respect to the ban on eunuchs and bastards, that is, their being barred from the congregation, it is to the 10th generation. According to one editorial footnote in the Talmud, entering into the congregation of the Lord meant, quote, eligible to intermarry with Israelites, end quote. And according to another editorial note, the expression to his 10th generation meant, quote, the stigma is perpetual, end quote. The ban on intermarriage was probably a real factor. Certainly the penalty would work to make intermarriage difficult, but this does not get to the root of the matter. The ban was not on faith. That is, it is not stated that the bastards and eunuchs, nor, in Deuteronomy 23:3, that Ammonites and Moabites cannot be believers. There is, in fact, a particularly strong promise of blessing to believing eunuchs in Isaiah 56, 4-5, and their place as proselytes was real, even in the era of hardened Pharisaism, Acts 8, 27-28. The Moabitess Ruth intermarried twice, first with a son of Naomi, then with Boaz, to become an ancestress of Jesus Christ. Ruth 1:4, 4:13, 18-21, Matthew 1:5. There is no reason to doubt that eunuchs, bastards, Ammonites, and Moabites regularly became believers and were faithful worshippers of God. Congregation has reference to the whole nation in its governmental function as God's covenant people. G. Ernest Wright defined it as, quote, the whole organized commonwealth as it assembled officially for various purposes, particularly worship, end quote. The men of the legitimate bloodline constituted the heads of houses and of tribes. These men were the congregation of Israel, not the women and children nor excluded persons. All the integrity and honesty required by the law was due to every stranger, Leviticus 19:33-34. And it was certainly not denied to a man's illegitimate child, nor to a eunuch, an Ammonite, or a Moabite. The purpose of the commandment is here the protection of authority. Authority among God's people is holy. It does require a separateness. It does not belong to every man simply on the ground of his humanity. The Berkeley version reading of Deuteronomy 23:1-3 would allow for the admission of these excluded persons at the 10th generation. There is some ground for such an interpretation in terms of Deuteronomy 23:7-8, where the Edomites are given entrance into the assembly of the Lord on the 3rd generation. The grounds for exclusion are significant. Edom met Israel with open, honest enmity, Numbers 20, verses 18 and 20, and Egypt worked to destroy them, Exodus 1:22. But Ammon and Moab instead worked to pervert Israel, Numbers 22, 25, 31, 16, after Israel showed them forbearance, Deuteronomy 2, verses 9, 19, and 29. A faint echo of this principle appeared in Napoleon's treatment of Surgeon Major Mouton, who had demeaned the Princess of Liechtenstein and the men of her household. Napoleon, summoning Mouton before his staff, declared, quote, "Understand this, gentlemen. One kills men, but one never puts them to shame. Let him, Mouton, be shot." End quote. Later, Mouton's life was spared, and he understood the lesson. Edom and Egypt sought to kill Israel. Ammon and Moab tried to pervert and degrade Israel, and their judgment was accordingly severe. Other causes of ceremonial and physical uncleanness were cited. An issue of blood, Leviticus 15, verses 2-16 and 19-26. Childbirth, Leviticus 12, 1-2, 4-5. Menstruation, Leviticus 15, 19-30 and 18-19. Sexual intercourse, as against the fertility cult belief that it involved communion with the gods, Leviticus 15, 16-18 and 18-20. Unclean persons, Numbers 19-22. The spoils of war, Numbers 31, 21-24. And also the unauthorized touching or eating of holy things, Leviticus 22, 3 and 14. The humanistic approach sees a daintiness with respect to things in these laws, or else a puritanical abhorrence of them. Nothing could be further from the truth. The point at issue is not man's response to things, but his holiness in terms of separation to the living God. Many of the things cited constituted in paganism particular ways of holiness. Here, the ground of holiness is separation unto God. The subject of vows is closely linked to holiness. To vow is to devote something or oneself to God, to sanctify it to Him. The laws of vows, as well as the laws of redemption of things vowed, appear in Leviticus 22:21, 27, 1-29, Numbers 6, 3-21 and 30, 1-15, Deuteronomy 12, 6 and 26, 23, 21-33. Vows were voluntary, but an important aspect of the vow brings us to a third aspect of the laws of holiness. A man was always bound by his vow. Man, created in the image of God, was called to walk under God's law and in obedience to the creation mandate. John Marsh has called attention to a telling aspect of man's image responsibility. Quote, "A man is always unconditionally bound by either kind of vow, that is, vows of every kind, and a vow of abstinence. It is interesting to note that for the Hebrew mind, even a man's word should accomplish that which is imposed. God's word, of course, always did. It could not return to him void. A man might cherish intentions to do certain things and not be bound by them, but once his intention was expressed in words, then the obligation was laid upon him unconditionally." End quote. Such a vow could only be made by a freeman. Once made, the vow had to be fulfilled. The vow of an unmarried woman could be overruled by her father. Being under authority, she was not free to do as she pleased. The same was true of a married woman, Numbers 30, 1-16. A divorced woman or a widow was free to vow, being independent. The implication was clear. A woman's holiness and devotion is subject first of all to the authority of her husband. God's law disallows all vows of service which a woman vows without her husband's or father's consent. A woman's holiness is not to be found in an evasion of her place. A special kind of vow was that of the Nazirite, Numbers 6, 2-21. A Nazirite was a man or a woman who vowed a vow and for a season observed strict laws of separation in the course of the discharge of his vow. Abstinence from strong drink of any kind and from grapes and raisins, no cutting of the hair, and separation from the dead marked the noticeable aspect of his vow. The usual period of the vow was brief. There was no separation from the routine of family life and work. The essence of the Nazirite's separation was not in the abstinence, but in the separation unto the Lord, in the discharge of a particular service or vow. A fourth aspect of holiness appears in matters of food. No flesh torn by beasts of the field could be eaten. Exodus 22:31, that is, meat not properly butchered. Leviticus 7:22-27. The first fruits were given to the Lord. Exodus 23:19 and 34:26, indicating thereby the holiness of the entirety. The eating of fat and blood was forbidden. Leviticus 7:22-27 and 19:26. Clean and unclean animals for eating are listed. Leviticus 11. While dead animals and other unclean animals are forbidden to the covenant people. If foreigners regard them as good food, there is no harm in selling them such items. Leviticus 17:10-16 and Deuteronomy 14:21. Fruit trees should be allowed 5 years' growth before they are regarded as circumcised and edible. Leviticus 19:23-26. The circumcision of the tree was its ceremonial picking in the 4th year in dedication to the Lord. Foods forbidden by God should be abominable to his people. Leviticus 20:25 and Deuteronomy 14:13-21. There is no question but that these laws were and are basic to good health. There is also no question about the fact that they are laws of holiness. These laws of holiness are a blessing, Deuteronomy 12:15, to the physical life of God's people, that is, to their health. In this respect, they are another law of separation from death. Health is thus an aspect of holiness, and the fullness of health is in the resurrection. A fifth aspect of holiness has reference to dress. Transvestite dress is an abomination to the Lord, Deuteronomy 22:5. It is a sterile and perverse hostility to God's created order. Similarly, wearing a garment of mingled materials, wool and linen together, Deuteronomy 22:11, compared with Leviticus 19:19, is forbidden. To bring diverse things together in an unnatural union is to despise the order of God's creation. Sixth, the very land itself is holy and can be defiled even by leaving a hanged man up overnight, Deuteronomy 21:22-23. In brief, the land itself must be regarded as separated and devoted to God. We have here an instance of case law. If a body left out overnight defiles a land, how much more so man's abusive use of the soil, his contempt of God's creation, and his attempt to hybridize and mingle what God ordained to be separate. Finally, seventh, it should be noted that while evangelical Christians today are greatly concerned with personal holiness, the Bible is also concerned with national holiness. The summons to be a holy people repeatedly declared has reference to the nation, called to be an holy nation, Exodus 19:6. The holiness of a nation rests in its law structure. Where God's laws are enforced and true faith protected, there a holy nation exists. The cutting edge of the law is the principle of national holiness. Without this foundation of law, no holiness can exist. By means of God's law, a nation devotes itself to life. Without God's law, it is devoted to death, cut off from the only true principle of life. At every point, thus, holiness brings us face to face with very material laws. Every biblical law is concerned with holiness. All law creates a line of division, a separation between the law-abiding and the law-breaking peoples. Without law, there can be no separation. The modern antipathy to and open hatred of law is also a hatred of holiness. It is an attempt to destroy the line of separation between good and evil by abolition of law. But because God is holy, law is written into the structure of all being. Law cannot be abolished. It can only be enforced, if not by man, then surely by God.